I'd like to welcome everybody to our session on socialism this afternoon. Thank you for coming to hear us here. We have three speakers in this session. Rafael Acevedo from Texas Tech University, originally from Venezuela, who's going to speak on desocialization of enterprises and empowering Venezuelans. He'll go first. Next, we have Yuri Maltsev of Carthage College, who will speak on the contributions of Austrian School economists in exposing the true nature of socialism. And then third, we have Edward Fuller, who's an independent researcher from Palo Alto, California, who will speak on whether Keynes was a socialist. What we'll do is we'll have each of the speakers go in order with, if you have a clarifying, brief question immediately after the speaker's talk, we'll allow for those at that time. But if you have a question that is more involved or a question that intersects with several of the papers, then I'd ask that you hold that until the end. We have some time reserved at the end for questions as well. So let's welcome Rafael Acevedo.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here and giving me this opportunity. I will talk to you about the paper, The Socialization of Enterprises, Empowering Venezuelans. It's being written by Professors Rocco Luis, Hugo Faria, Maria Lorca Susina, and I will talk about the facts, the purposes of the paper, the skepticism on Venezuelans' capacities as a historical course, and respond some questions about the socialization process that we are proposing. And finally, I will show you the proposal. Transparencia Venezuela, that is an NGO, said that from 2001 to 2017, the state-owned enterprises increased from 74 enterprises to 526, which means 4 times the state-owned enterprises in Brazil and 10 times the state-owned enterprises in Argentina. Other data about these enterprises is that just 8 companies in the oil, manufacturing, agri-food, financial, and electrical sectors in 2016 incurring losses of approximately $400 million. Just to let you know, it's a figure that exceeded the nation's budget for health, education, housing, and social security in that year. PDVSA, that is the oil state-owned company of Venezuela, in that year had a negative balance estimating $238 million. And Corpole Elec, that is the electrical monopoly of Venezuela, had a negative balance estimating $45 million just that year. And you have to know that between 2012 to 2015, the government supposedly invested in the electrical sector in a lot of money. Just one case, the corruption case that is being investigated in this moment, is the Derwit and Associates, that is $5 billion, supposedly for improved the electrical sector in Venezuela. Hidrovent is the freshwater monopoly in Venezuela, also had an investment of approximately $5 billion. But what are the results of this state government management of these enterprises? Let's see.
We want water.
Hundreds of people
That's
rushed to the
weeks
Guayra
ago.
River on Tuesday after noticing water flowing into the city's contaminated stream. Most of them from the city's ghettos, these people have not had any water for days.
Yo tengo 5 niños.
I have 5 children. How am I supposed to wash them and feed them?
Our children are dying from thirst and starvation. We are totally broke, with no food, no water, nothing.
Some were too late, heading home empty-handed.
Many Venezuelans are frustrated that they've been deprived of water and electricity for several days now, and that's why they're blocking this road in protest of the government. And the police is here trying to intervene, but they're saying that they just can't take this situation any longer.
As rolling power cuts continue throughout the country, there has been a rise in cases of lootings across the city, as many shops and businesses remained shut. Basic necessities like food, water, and medicine are even more scarce. President Nicolás Maduro said his government is putting up a fight to restore his country's electrical system, while avoiding further cyber attacks that he claims are aimed at disrupting the recovery efforts. In the meantime, the opposition-controlled National Assembly held an extraordinary session at the request of Juan Guaidó. The opposition leader has called...
Okay, that's enough. So, that's the result, is the proof that the Mrs. Worth are right. When Mrs. said, if control of production is shifted from the hands of entrepreneurs, the alien elected by a plebiscite of the consumers into the hands of the supreme commander of the industrial armies are of the armed workers, neither representative government nor any civil liberties can survive. That's a real situation in Venezuela. So what are our purposes? Our purposes with this paper is the socialization program inspired by Rothbard, 1992, the paper How and How Not to Desocialize a Country, that abides by the principles of not confiscating people's money, taxes as low and simple as possible, and not allowing government ownership of firms. We intend with this program, privatize all state-owned enterprise, even the PDVSA and all the state-owned assets. Okay, we discussed about the historical skepticism on the capacities of Venezuelans to enjoy total economic freedom and be shareholders of the state-owned enterprises, because that's a bias created by the politicians that we have not the virtues to enjoy freedom. But that is a historical course. We asked that, and we find in our research that yes, that trend is from the history of Venezuela. Even in the independence days of Venezuela, Venezuelans are not capable of handling their own freedom and wealth in a proper manner. That is what current politicians and the elites say against our proposal. But if you research in the historical process in Venezuela, you find quotes like this: generally speaking, our fellow citizens are not yet ready to take on the full and independent exercise of the rights because they lack the political virtues marking the true citizen of a republic. The Venezuelan people not prepared for the supreme good of freedom. That was said by Simón Bolívar, our liberator. And I don't believe that George Washington said something like this, okay? And yes, Hugo Faria explained why. Hugo Faria and Montesino explained that while American founders wanted freedom, Venezuelan generals caudillos wanted independence from Spain. Venezuela's independence was established in 1821 by European descendants and for European descendants. They wanted just the political power because in that moment, the law of the crown, of the Spain crown, will not allow, did not allow the descendants of Spanish people that were born out of Spain to take the political power. For that reason, Simón Bolívar cannot hold the political power if they don't, do the liberation process of Venezuela. Faria also states that trusting others is necessary to embrace economic freedom, but Venezuela is among the countries of the world with the lowest trust level. And on measuring individualism, very important for the economic freedom and the private property, Venezuela is located in the lowest quartile among the rated countries. Venezuela is a collectivistic society. It was created by the politicians and the elites like a collectivistic society. Venezuela can be construed, on the other hand, as an extreme case of a country with a legal system originating in French civil law, the system that allows more interventionism than the English common law. So we have a lot of problems and an enormous enemy against our proposal. The skepticism that is the bias against freedom and the distrust on individuals' capacities that the historical and political processes have created with the intent to preserve the omnipotent, interventionist, and socialist state, assuring the monopolistic management and ownership of power and of the commanding heights of the economy. So how to desocialize Venezuela is the main question that we have. Well, Rothbard shows the wide lines that we have adapted after considering particular situations. How we did that? We studied the privatization programs of some Eastern European countries, such as Georgia, with the Wendel-Kitz's program, and Lewandowski programs in Poland, and others. We focus our efforts just in those countries with similar characteristics with Venezuela, okay? We do not include some experiences also in the United States, Canada, United Kingdom with Thatcher, and other institutionally better countries around the world have great examples of how governments manage and head the privatization process. That makes sense because Venezuela has not the institution of those countries, okay? Other question, will the socialization of enterprises face some problem? Absolutely, yes. Privatization programs involves facing problems such as cronyism, corruption, interventionism, lack of transparency, lack of punishment. Nevertheless, we found also good examples of how to succeed with the lowest or better new state interventionism, support of the rulers, and setting their just subjects free as fast and as completely as it takes to unlock their shackles, as Rothbard said that. Our desocialization proposal will face some problems, but they will be overcome with the implementation of a real free market economy and by minimizing the presence, influence, and management of the state in the process. This is an indispensable condition to succeed in any desocialization plan for Venezuela. We agree with the four general principles that Rothbard said about the socialization process. Drastic reduction in taxes, returning property of the assets owned by the government to the original expropriated owner, honoring complete and secure property rights in the sense of providing complete freedom to transfer property, and depriving the government the power to create new money. Nevertheless, the conditions of Venezuela, we had to impose some restrictions in our proposal, especially concerning points 2 and 3 of Rothbard's points. Moreover, if expropriated owners were fully compensated, because some enterprises were fully compensated to the former owners, others were overpaid for the bribes, etc., okay? Then it is natural that the legitimate owners are the Venezuelans. The proposal, the scope of the proposal is all state-owned enterprises, SOE, and state-owned assets, SOA. The beneficiaries, all Venezuelans by birth and aged at least 18 years by the moment of when the desocialization process takes place, residents or not in Venezuela, they will have to enroll in a private national or international financial institution of their preference, which will represent them in all the process. For example, in my case, I can select Bank of America or Wells Fargo or anywhere, okay? The Desocialization Board will be formed by one representative per financial institution having at least 4% of the total Venezuelans enrolled in the process. One representative per branch of the state, executive, judicial, and legislative. We have other restrictions for the Desocialization Board in the proposal. For example, the the representatives per branch of the state has only voice but not vote, has no decision, and other things that is more clear in the proposal. The Financial Rescue Fund, FRF, will be created as a fund managed by the DB to rescue some SOEs and pay liabilities. Funds will come from the process itself. We do not want that the government gave money to the process. All the money that needed for the complete process has to come to the sale of the enterprises and the assets of the country. 6 groups of SOEs and SOAs will be created. The socialization group, those SOEs fulfilling the socialization process. The rescue group, the SOEs that can reach the requirements of the desocialization group upon following this process. The public auction, those SOEs that will be sold entirely as a whole, or the SOAs not classified as clearing assets. The clearing asset, all SOAs, totally depreciated or in junk condition. For example, in Venezuela, the state has a lot of vehicles, has a lot of buildings, has a lot of farms, has a lot of that kind of assets. Okay, we classify between public action or clearance assets. Expropriated assets or enterprises, all those enterprises or assets expropriated or nationalized against the will of their former owners and not fully paid, just partial or non-paid. And the social assets, all those assets related to social programs given to citizens with no full property. For example, in Venezuela there are many housing complexes that the government gives just the tenure to the citizens, okay, of the apartments, the houses, etc. That's the social asset that we are talking. The Desocialization Board has to estimate the present value of all certified reserves of natural resources of each SOE and or SOA, and include it in the respective accountability of each one enterprise. The social assets, those houses, those apartments, will be transferred immediately. We want no problem with that assets. Immediately transferred to citizens that have the tenure of the property, full ownership. Because there are other proposals that gave the partial ownership, they cannot sell, they cannot mortgage. We're saying full ownership, they can sell whatever they want to do with the property. The expropriated assets of enterprises, we develop this little proportion and model to devolve the enterprises or the assets to the non-fully paid former owners, okay? For example, the first is the less probable, because the current market value of the enterprise will be larger than the old. That will not be a possibility in Venezuela. I will explain the second. All market value is $100. For example, when the government nationalized or expropriated the enterprise worth $100 in the market value, and paid $80, and the current market value is $10. That's the most close to the reality. So we say we do some proportion. For example, the current market value, the difference between the current market value and the paid amount minus the difference of the old market value and the paid amount. And that would be like an indemnization. We'll give the property to the former owner and we'll give that indemnization to the former owner. If the government did not pay anything, well, the property will give transferred immediately to the former owner plus an indemnization that would be the current value minus the old market value. The clearance assets and the public auction will be sold through a technological system based on blockchain. This to be sure of the transparency, where all people can know the buyers and the process of these sales. For example, in Georgia, you can go to the site that they have for the privatization programs. For the rescuable and the socialization group, there is other kind of process that we have. The liabilities, we will do an equity swap. We change the liabilities for equity, and the rest of the capitalization and the rest of the equity will be distributed 70% in equal parts to the beneficiaries, that is the Venezuelans, and 30% in the international market. There's some restriction in our proposal. If the total assets are greater than liabilities by 30% or more, or if the total assets are less than total liabilities or greater than below 30%. We have all those restrictions considering the situation that some enterprises will have the back of the natural reservoirs of natural resources, okay? Other kind of restriction that is important that you know is that the property of all SOEs and SOAs, that the socialization program encompasses, will include the property of the corresponding soil and subsoil, because in Venezuela, the property is just over the soil, okay? For a term of 3 years, after the day of the official desocialization, neither any person nor any company can buy and or hold more than 3% of the equity of any SEOs desocialized. At least it were obtained as payment of liabilities, okay? For example, any person could buy more than 3% of the equity of any enterprises. And the Venezuelans that obtain the shares through the socialization process, the 70% that is distributed to Venezuelans, cannot sell that shares for 3 years. Okay, this is within the intent of avoid those problems in Eastern Europe, European countries, where people was short-sighted for any other people. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Do we have any clarifying questions for Mr. Acevedo? Yes.
In reference to your first slide, you said that from 2001 to 2011, the number of state enterprises increased from 74 to 500 plus something, right? Can you give us approximate percentage? So how many state enterprises today out of the entire economy?
At this moment?
Right now, or maybe later, I don't know if we have time.
I think that at this moment, is almost...
Yeah, this right now. I thought about the question. I thought answer the question after.
Well, maybe we hold that till after the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, okay, thank you. Next we have Yuri Maltsev. I'm going to get your slides pulled up here.
Well, I remember Murray Rothbard, he was talking about desocialization. He said, land to peasants, factories to workers, and bureaus to bureaucrats. Russians and computers or technology don't go together well. I think yes it is. Okay, great. All right, well, Austrian School of Economics definitely is the school which opposes socialism. It was from the very beginning the most anti-socialist school in the history of economic thought. No other school, even close, even Chicago School, is not even close to the great work that the Austrians did to expose socialism as a modern slavery, and that's what it is. Modern slavery in the sense that the most developed socialism is nothing but taking property of the people and passing it to the government, and even property by the people itself. John Locke, if you remember, he was asking questions, who owns you? Who owns you? And if you own yourself, you are a free man. And if somebody else owns you, then you are a slave. And that's exactly what socialism is. Well, socialism also is when you take property from rightful owners, then you need to manage this property in this or that way. And then you need to manage it without the market, so without market prices. So you need to introduce some kind of central planning. And in the very beginning, socialism was just a kind of Marxian socialist, was just emerging, and already there were critics of central planning, And amazingly enough, because I worked in Kremlin, well, work is kind of overstatement of my activities. But I remember Mr. Gorbachev, when he would say, comrades, some of you erroneously blame central planning in our problems. The problem is not central planning. The problem is that we never had a good plan. and that's exactly what happens for socialism from the very beginning. Well, even before Austrian School, there was Prussian economist Hermann Heinrich Gossen, who was opposing the Historische Schule, the historical school of Gustav Schmoller, Franz Liszt, and others. And his point was that it's impossible to do any kind of economic planning without prices. Then Dutch economist, who later became Minister of Finance and then Prime Minister of Netherlands, was Nicholas Pearson. He also made a point that the problem is economic calculation. And he was not an Austrian economist, but he was very close to, because he got his education not in German universities, which were distributing something called Cathedra Socialism or Socialism of the Chair, but he studied in Cambridge University before Cambridge University became a communist institution. Then the first Austrian who really made a great input into closing of the Marx system was Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk. And I would say that here in this audience, I can see some very, I would say, very efficient and very heroic slayers of socialism, One of them is Roger Garrison, who reviewed the work of Böhm-Bawerk, and he wrote that Karl Marx, at the close of his system, established that the question of how income is distributed among the factors of production is fundamentally an economic rather than a political question. Today, it's getting back to political question, as you know, that today already you have a right for this, right for that, right for $15 minimum wage. And the Austrian answer effectively rebutted the labor theory of value, as well as the so-called iron law of wages, which was reigning supreme in the minds of historical school economists in the middle of the 19th century. Then there was there's some Austrian economists that we don't know much about, but for example, one of them was Johann von Komorzinski. And Komorzinski, he was trying to find, like we have Andrei Znamensky here, who is writing a book on definitions of socialism. And that was his following Johann von Komorzinski, who was trying to find out what actually socialism is. And that socialism is some kind of its good socialism, like philanthropic or family socialism, that we are sacrificing for our children or for the people we love and whatnot. And there's nothing bad, but there's a delusory socialism made purely at class interest, class hatred, and putting up rights against other people's property and welfare. So these are in the country I came from, in Russia, we had this wonderful economist, Roman Ordzhensky. And Roman Ordzhensky, he was the pioneer of Austrian School in Russia. And unfortunately, he was working mostly during revolution, so not much of his work was published. Now only they're recovering some of it and publishing in their historical journals and magazines. Yeah, but at that time, the government, the Lenin himself, he hated Austrian school with such a passion that in 1923, Roman Ordzhensky, who flew from Soviet Union to Poland, and he was professor of economics at the University of Warsaw, that the NKVD, the secret police of the Soviet Union, they blew him up together with 23 other people just because that was the critique of the Austrian School of Economics. Nikolai Bukharin, amazingly enough, he was very interesting politician, and he took classes with Böhm-Bawerk in Vienna, and he hated Austrian school with passion. His point was that it is the most powerful enemy that we Marxists do face, because his point is that we need to come up with a lot of answers to questions that Austrian school economists are asking us. Yes, so this is Mr. Bukharin. Mr. Bukharin, he, however, didn't survive himself. Stalin in 1938, he was shot. Mr. Bukharin was shot. It's kind of like spiders in a jar, and that's the Mr. Bukharin also is all covered with blood and minced meat of innocent people. So that's the. So if we will look at the first stage of development of Austrian economics, well, Menger, what's the major thing? Was subjectivism, spontaneous order, marginalist revolution. This is the subjective theory of value, rejection of objective theory of value, of labor value theory. Böhm-Bawerk, that the question of how income is distributed among the factors of production. And this is the question because and that's the marginal product of labor, that's what labor does. So that's the, then Wieser contributions to economics. Wieser was probably the most liberal, in a bad sense, economist in the Austrian school, but he promoted imputation theory and opportunity costs. That's his great also contribution. And Mises' contribution to economics, it's business cycle theory, theory of money and credit, and the most, I would say, the most focused on socialism is his economic calculation issues. And so he proved that socialism is impossible even if you would like to have it. It's the same thing that now this Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is making news all the time. And I'm very much surprised that many serious economists are writing that we just don't have enough money to do that. That's like $90 trillion, whatever. One thing, should we do it if it will be cheaper? than to give our freedom for less, and the whole thing is putting a price on the idiotic communist socialist ideas. It's just like to tell Hitler that he doesn't have enough to kill the Jews. That's the economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth. That is the first notes for that was already in 1918. In 1920 was a well-published and already well-circulated essay. Economic calculation, I had a privilege to write an introduction to the 1991 edition of this book, of this essay. And the significance is that socialism is impossible just because already of information. There are two major issues with socialism. One is the issue of information, because you cannot centralize information in society. That's mostly Hayekian focus on information. Then there's also the calculation. I mean, how would you know? How do you know anything about anything? Even Lenin himself, in 1922, he made the point that when the whole world will become socialist, we should leave one capitalist country. He said, I prefer Switzerland. He lived in Switzerland, so he was not so monstrous to Swiss. And so leave Switzerland just to see what the prices should look like, how the price should look like. Otherwise, you really don't know. So economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth, this probably was the first kind of really scientific repudiation of the whole socialist ideology after the victory of the Bolshevik, of the socialist revolution in Russia. So that's then in his magnum opus, Human Action, Mises, he subsumes subjectivist aspects of catalactics within the concept of economic calculation. The book is organized into 7 parts containing 39 chapters. He devotes entire part of the book, part 3, to economic calculation issues. However, the issue of rejecting socialism goes through all 39 chapters. And why I'm just making quotes to recognize my colleagues and friends from the von Mises Institute who also are fighting socialism like every Austrian economist does. Then Hayek. Hayek is, he spent more time, probably in his life, with the Fatal Conceit, his last book, and with Constitution of Liberty, and with the popular book, Road to Serfdom. He is a real slayer of socialist ideology. And he's focusing on economics of knowledge, economics of information, that we just cannot do it. However, he is also looking quite attentively into the other problem, the problem of incentives, because the problem of knowledge, some mainstream neoclassical economists like Bergson, for example, would say, what about knowledge? They know, say in Soviet Union, that they don't have shoes or bread, so there is knowledge that we need to make them. However, there is no incentives to do that. That's what the reason is. So this is all the time kind of, there's two issues, major incentives, because there's absolutely no incentive in the egalitarian society to do anything. That's why they would resort to murder. The murder was the only incentive. And I remember I was writing a chapter on Hayek and the demise of the socialist system. For this, they already published 14 volumes. 14 volumes. That sounds like a torturous thing, but while rereading a chapter that was published in, I think in the volume number 7, yes, I found a delightful chapter by Doug French about how the ideas of Hayek were actually formed by his mentor, Ludwig von Mises. So what Hayek's major contribution to the critique of socialism? He accepted calculation argument and recognition that despite the truth of Mises' argument, it was not going to deter attempts by the left-wing economists to challenge Mises in theory and for politicians to realize socialism in practice. That the road to serfdom, his 1944 book was all about. That was a very powerful book. I think I probably mentioned it before that in the Soviet Union. Somebody gave, that was my gateway to Austrian economics, and I was given this book for one night. And if I would be caught reading it, I would get 7 years of prison. And the gentleman who gave it to me would get 15 years for dissemination of anti-Soviet slander. So that was a powerful book. And amazingly enough, when Soviet Union collapsed, then it was Yeltsin government. He was not a libertarian, definitely. Well, we don't even know whom he was, because he was, as in Russia would say, he was governing under influence. But they published 7 million copies of Road to Serfdom. Some of them like separate editions, some of them in the big literary journals and whatnot. Yes, I have some claim to popularity of Hayek in the United States. I think I maybe mentioned that I got once a phone call from certain Victoria Grace. And she said, I'm Victoria Grace. I said, you're calling from Leslie Nielsen. Remember, he has this kind of character. She said, no, I'm calling from Glenn Beck's show. And he wants you to be on the show with Tom Woods. And I said, to do what? And she said, well, you must come up with a topic. I said, how about Road to Serfdom? Because I just did a speech for my students about it. And she said, what is that? I said, it's a book. She said, a book? Oh, who cares about a book? And I said, but you can use it. You can use it. I mean, there's a lot of like ditch on the road, certainly the U-turn, the dead end, whatever, all the traffic terminology. And she, without any optimism, she said, okay, we will try to find what's going on. And I'm already leaving thinking that that's gone. And then the phone rings. She said, can you come tomorrow to New York? I said, no, I can't. She said, Monday. No. She said, Tuesday I can, yeah. And I'm sending you airline tickets and you are booked for this, whatever, because, well, and I said, why it's such a change of heart? She said, Mr. Beck, he loved this book, yeah. And he was waving this book saying, America, read this book, America, read the book. And next morning I'm getting a call from David Ramsey Steele from University of Chicago Publishing House. And he said, what did you do with Tom yesterday on TV? I said, not much. He said, we already got, it's 11 o'clock only, but we already got orders for 300,000 copies. 300,000 copies, so I kind of, at least, I think I paid back to Friedrich August for what he, so then his major things, that claim for equality of material possession can be met only by a government with totalitarian powers. So the murders are essential. So, and they did murder about 200 million people, according to Rudy Rummel, the major United States demographer. That emergencies, that crisis is what socialism, that 12 years from now, we're all dead, according to Ms. Cortez. So we have on 12 years. And Hayek used to say that to greatly expand the power of government and curtail individual liberty, you need a crisis. This crisis can be real, imaginary, or fabricated. Now we have imaginary crisis, and that's what global warming is. And global warming today is a new kind of new clothes for that. Then I'm trying to be as fast as I can. Then we have Murray Rothbard and Lou Rockwell, another two heroes in struggle for freedom. And Murray Rothbard, if you are interested, I wrote a couple of pieces on Murray Rothbard as a critic of socialism, and one is in his In Memoriam book, so I'm just trying to skip because I have little time. So this is, and also it was in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, wrote about his his immense contributions. He hated socialism with great passion, Then we come out the Hans Hoppe. Hans Hoppe, he's right now become already a classical economist of the Austrian School, and yeah, here he looks like a teacher in madrasa or something. And his great book is a Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. This is a seminal book. It was his first book in English, actually, and that's the and he distinguished between different versions of socialism in different places, different countries, then how the property rights do play everything. And again, I kind of can't believe I lived so long that I even wrote a chapter for in his book about Hans Hoppe, essays in honor of Hans Hermann Hoppe, in which I also was describing his role in criticizing of socialism. That book is great, the theory of socialism and capitalism, but now he's focusing on the new kind of versions of socialism, which are being made kind of palatable by our fake news industry, that our mass media is promoting the social democracy, promoting all kind of other modern things. This is actually a book. It's free right there. So it's a great book. So okay, then I'll just kind of like listing like a telephone book. Then Jesus Huerta de Soto, Socialism, Economic Calculation, and Entrepreneurship. This a great book. I'm using it in my teaching and my classes, and this is Jesus. And then definitely the last but not the least, great Austrian economist Thomas Di Lorenzo. The Problem with Socialism, it is a must to read for everyone. Because at first I was thinking it's a short book, probably very popular, whatever. And then I decided to open this book, and then I couldn't close it. It's a great book, yes. And he is applying the anti-socialist Austrian theory to all this liberal, progressive, economic democracy, social justice, Green New Deal. That's his last article, and so these are the kind of the issues that we have. We're really. I mean, I am too old to defect again. And I don't know where to. Yeah, that's because this is more than enough for me. That's what United States academia looks like today. Yeah. And I am maybe on 1/3 of my presentation, but if you can email, because I see my time is gone. So if you are interested in everything else, then you can email me, and I will be happy to send you all these gruesome pictures and whatever it is. Yeah, that's Hitler. It doesn't matter who owns the business, as long as they do more for the nation than for themselves with it. And all this climate science and whatever.
Hello, everyone. My name is Edward Fuller. I'm going to present a paper called Was Keynes a Socialist? And this is being published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics. So I'm excited. I think a lot of Keynesians are going to read this. Here at the Mises Institute, I think most of us know that Keynes was a socialist. I don't know if it's especially controversial here. But the traditional view is that Keynes was not a socialist. Most historians and economists argue that he was not a socialist. So let's get to the evidence. Keynes was born in 1883. In 1902, he went off to Cambridge. And in 1905, he was one of the founding members of the Cambridge University Fabian Society. The Fabian Society is Britain's leading socialist propaganda organization during the 20th century, and its core leaders were Sidney Webb, Beatrice Webb, and Bernard Shaw. On October 24th, 1907, Bernard Shaw spoke at the Cambridge University Fabian Society, and Keynes was at this talk. And Keynes wrote to his lover the next day, Lytton Strachey, "Mr. Bernard Shaw converted us all to socialism last night." So by October 1907, we have tangible evidence of Keynes aligning himself with socialism. We can't just write this off. Keynes remained friends with Bernard Shaw for the rest of his life. That's a picture of them together in 1936, which was 30 years later. In 1911, Sidney Webb came to speak at Cambridge, and Keynes argued with Sidney Webb, the progressive reorganization of society on the lines of collectivist socialism is both inevitable and desirable. So he said this publicly. So by 1911, he is publicly announcing or aligning himself with socialism. Keynes's father was named John Neville Keynes. He was a Cambridge economist, and I have to stress he was incredibly close to his father. This is an entry from Neville's diary, Wednesday, September 6, 1911, and he says, "Maynard avows himself a socialist and in favor of the confiscation of wealth." So that word avows there is important. It means he's openly confessing that he's a socialist, that he's describing himself as a socialist. He's using that term to describe his political philosophy. We're going to go to the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. He wrote to his mother, "I was immensely cheered up and excited about the Russian news. It's the sole result of the war so far worth having. An acute and even struggle is now going on between the socialist and the constitutionalist." So he's celebrating this revolution, and he recognizes that it is indeed a socialist revolution. Later in December, he writes to his mother again, "The only course open to me is to be buoyantly Bolshevik." So he's saying the only course open to me is to be buoyantly socialist, right? And he writes again to his mother in February. He says, well, I should give you some context. He was awarded a medal by the provisional government in Russia, and he said, "Being a Bolshevik, I cannot accept this medal." So he's saying, I am a Bolshevik, I am a socialist. In September 1918, he met Clarence W. Barron. He's the founder of Barron's Magazine. He's a legendary financial journalist. And Barron wrote, "Lady Kennard says Keynes is a kind of socialist, and my judgment is that he is a socialist of the type that does not believe in the family." So here we have two people, Clarence Barron, and Lady Kennard was a British socialite that traveled in Keynes' circle, and both of them acknowledge in 1918 that Keynes was a socialist. In April 26, 1922, he says, "An extraordinary experiment in socialism is in the course of development. I think there may be solid foundations on which to build a bridge." So he's saying here that I want to build a bridge to socialism, right? He's admitting that he's a socialist. In 1924, he says, "The true socialism of the future will emerge, I think, from an endless variety of experiments." Now, what's important about this passage is that he uses the words true socialism of the future. So he's differentiating different types of socialism. He's acknowledging that socialism is not a monolith, that there are different types of socialism, and that there are true socialisms and false socialisms. Excuse me, I have to go back. Okay, in 1924, this is an incredibly important document in my mind. He wrote an outline for a book called Prolegomena to a New Socialism. Keynes wrote outlines for books. He didn't end up finishing a lot of the books that he planned to write. I'll get into this document a little bit more, but again, he's focused on this new socialism, right? He's differentiating his socialism from other types of socialism. In 1924, Keynes was a founding vice president of the Society for Cultural Relations with the USSR. It's hard to see, but you can see his name there at the top. The SCR was financed and controlled by Vox, and Vox was the Soviet government's international propaganda agency, so there is some link here between Keynes and the Soviet government. Oh, excuse me. In 1925, Keynes married Lydia Lopakova. She was a Russian ballerina. She was also a socialist, and they honeymooned in the Soviet Union in September. And he spoke to the Soviet Politburo, and Leon Trotsky attended. And Trotsky wrote, "Mr. Keynes told us only the other day that the salvaging of the English economy lies in Malthusianism. For England, too, the road of overcoming the contradictions between city and country leads through socialism." So here we have Trotsky aligning Keynes with socialism. He's a good authority on socialism. For a little context here, Keynes was a member of the Bloomsbury Group, and he lived in the Bloomsbury group with Virginia Woolf and Leonard Woolf. And when Virginia Woolf committed suicide, Keynes wrote to his mother that the Woolfs were his dearest friends. And this is what Virginia Woolf says. Lydia and Maynard are both completely under the sway of the Webbs. The great Keynes is at Beatrice Webb's feet. This is a picture of them in 1926. That's Keynes with Beatrice and Sidney. And Keynes wrote this year, he says, I have played in my mind with the possibilities of greater social changes than come within the present philosophies of, let us say, Mr. Sidney Webb. The republic of my imagination lies on the extreme left of celestial space. So what he's saying here is, I'm even more of a socialist than Webb, right? He's on the extreme left, the farthest left that you can possibly imagine. And this is problematic because if we want to argue that Keynes is not a socialist, then we have to start arguing that Sidney Webb was not a socialist, which is absurd, right? So I think I like this quote. In October 1927, the Soviet government invited Keynes to come and celebrate the 10th year of the Republic. And he wrote to his wife, I was much flattered last night by getting the enclosed invitation from the Bolsheviks to go to Russia next month to celebrate the 10th year of the Republic. My first impulse was to accept. The idea is very attractive. So he's flattered by this, right? And so he goes on this trip, and I'll admit, you know, he has some reservations, but he says the USSR is much more normal than anyone here thinks, and he reaffirms my sympathy with communists over money motives, that is the profit motive or economic calculation. You know, he's famously very critical of the rentier. So again, this is in 1929, he gives a speech called Social Reform is the New Socialism. And he writes, the dogma of laissez-faire for its own sake ought now to be abandoned. It is plain that the economic machine does not work perfectly. We must therefore be prepared to consider on all their merits all kinds of proposals for state action, all kinds of proposals. I can think of many radical and far-reaching schemes. So this is just an indication of just how radical Keynes was. I don't think a lot of Keynes scholars are very honest about how radical he really was. In 1929, the British Labour government won the general election, and it was the general election, and Ramsay MacDonald, the man in the corner there, became the first British socialist prime minister, and he formed something called the Economic Advisory Council, and Keynes was on this council. And Hugh Dalton, another council member, wrote, Keynes hurts the PM's feelings by describing himself at one meeting as the only socialist present. So this is important because he's using the word socialism to describe his political philosophy, and he's saying, I'm the most socialist person here. Like, these are all socialists, and he's saying, I'm more of a socialist than you, Ramsay MacDonald, or you, Hugh Dalton, okay? So again, he's pretty radical. In 1930, he published his first major treatise on economics. It was called A Treatise on Money, and he imagined socialistic action by which some official body steps into the shoes which the feet of the entrepreneurs are too cold to occupy. So this is a treatise on money, but he just has to, you know, throw in this little comment about socialism. In 1930, he started associating with Oswald Mosley, who was the founder of the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists. In 1930, Oswald Mosley leaked the Mosley Manifesto, and this is Keynes's copy from his paper here. And Keynes said, this is a socialist document, by the way. He says, it's a very able document and illuminating, and I do not see what practical socialism can mean for our generation in England unless it makes much of Mosley's manifesto its own, this peculiar British socialism. And Mosley writes in his autobiography, I had the massive support of Keynes, not only in his theory, but as already noted in his personal intervention. Harold Nicholson confirmed this. He was another member of Mosley's party. He says, dined with Clive Bell and Keynes. Keynes is very helpful about the economics of the new party. He says that he would, without question, vote for it. So this is a fascist party, and Keynes is saying, hey, I'll vote for it. In 1931, I should mention that Keynes started developing the general theory in late 1931. Around this time, he gave a speech called A Survey of the Present Position of Socialism, and he gave this, this is a letter from his paper, he gave this speech to the Society for Socialist Inquiry and Propaganda. And he says, for my part, I should like to define the socialist program as aiming at political power. So he's saying, I want the socialists to get political power. Then he says, three motifs exist variously compounded in the breast of every socialist. For English purposes, one might perhaps sum the motifs up as the political, the practical, and the ideal. My goal is the ideal. So what he's saying here is the ideal is a socialist motif, and every socialist has this motif in his heart, and that he indeed has this in his heart, right? So he's admitting he's a socialist. And then he says, it will have to be on the basis of increased resources, not on the basis of poverty, that the grand experiment of the ideal republic will have to be made. So this ideal republic that he wants is a socialist republic. And he goes on later in the document, and he admits that this ideal that he has in mind is indeed a socialist republic. Around this time, 1931, 1932, he became an associate member of the New Fabian Research Bureau. This was Britain's leading socialist think tank. And I should mention that all of Keynes's major collaborators on the general theory were members. That includes Richard Kahn, Joan Robinson, James Mead, and Roy Harrod. So Roy Harrod was also a member of this socialist think tank. The 1932 draft of the general theory, the last chapter, was called Socialism, and that chapter became chapter 24 of the general theory, which is indeed a very, very important chapter in that book. In 1933, again, we get back to Moseley. Moseley wrote to Keynes congratulating him on his fascist economics. And Keynes' biographer writes, "It was Keynesianism which in the last resort made Moseley's fascism distinctly English." Again, Virginia Woolf, Keynes' dearest friend, wrote in 1933, "We are going over to Tilton to be converted by Maynard to what I suspect of being a form of fascism." And actually, Virginia nicknamed Keynes Dear Old Hitler. So I think we should all start calling Keynes Dear Old Hitler. I think it's a good nickname. 83 days before the general theory was published, Keynes voted for the Labour Party, the Socialist Party in Britain, and the platform was called For Socialism and Peace. So he's voting socialist right before the general theory is published. 119 days after the general theory was published, he wrote, "Until recently, events in Soviet Russia were moving too fast and the gap between the paper professions and the actual achievements was too wide for a proper account to be possible, but the new system is now sufficiently crystallized to be reviewed. The result is impressive." Ralph Rako thought this was a very important passage because here he is saying that Soviet, that is Stalinist Russia, is impressive, right? This is a problematic statement. In 1936, again, this is the same year the general theory was published, Beatrice Webb writes, "There's no reason why Keynes should not be among the leaders of the Labour Party. He is certainly more advanced than MacDonald and Thomas." So again, she's saying that Keynes is more of a socialist than Ramsay MacDonald. So if we want to argue that Keynes is not a socialist, we have to argue that Ramsay was not a socialist, which is absurd, right? And also in 1936, she records in her diary that he desires a modified socialism, so a new socialism, or that true socialism of the future. Keynes was a member of something called the Other Club. It was a dinner club. He dined with a man named John Buchan for over 10 years, and John Buchan described him as a gentlemanly communist, so a cathodder socialist, one of these champagne socialists, if you like. In 1939, he started supporting Sir Stafford Cripps. Sir Stafford Cripps was Beatrice Webb's nephew, and he became the president of the Fabian Society. And he fought to unite the Labour and Communist parties, and he was expelled from the Labour Party for that. But Keynes wrote, "I am all for Sir Stafford Cripps, and I would join his movement, his socialist movement," right? And he wrote, "Cripps, I'm in full sympathy with what you are doing." And what Cripps was doing was socialism. So he's saying, I am in full sympathy with socialism. This is a very important passage. I think that most Keynesians who do admit that Keynes was a socialist were converted by this passage. So if you're going to write down a passage, it's collected work 21, page 500. Keynes says, "The question is whether we are prepared to move out of the 19th century laissez-faire into an era of liberal socialism." So when you hear Keynesians admit that Keynes was a socialist, they'll typically describe him as a liberal socialist. I know that's not a good term. Liberalism and socialism are incompatible, but you'll hear that word associated with Keynes frequently. In 1944, Keynes was still the vice president of the Society for Cultural Relations with the USSR, and that was at the same time that he was designing the World Monetary System at Bretton Woods with Harry Dexter White, who was a Soviet spy. So, given this evidence, I've tried to show here that Keynes described himself as a socialist and that he consistently aligned himself with socialism throughout his entire life. So how can people like Robert Scalzi argue that he's not a socialist? And what they do is they use the traditional definition of socialism. So traditionally, socialism is defined as a system of economic organization based on government ownership of the means of production. So government ownership. And Mises did use that definition. So people like Skidelsky will argue, well, he didn't advocate government ownership, so he's not really a socialist. Here's the problem. These people do not define ownership properly, okay? Ownership is defined as exclusive control over a scarce resource. So economically, control and ownership are equivalent, okay? So remember, we're gonna focus on this word control here a bit. So what you'll see when you're reading Mises is he very often uses this definition. He says, socialism is a system based on public control of the means of production. So he used those two definitions interchangeably. Also, Schumpeter uses this definition. Sidney Webb also used it, and Friedman writes, socialism means government control of the means of production. That's the old-fashioned definition and a good one. So what was Keynes's main policy recommendation? He says the only solution is for long-term investment to be controlled by the state. Okay, so his main policy was government control of investment. Now, I'm sorry, I have to define investment. In economic theory, when we use the word investment, we're not talking about financial investment. We're talking about real investment, so capital goods. Keynes writes, investment is the increased production of material wealth in the shape of capital goods, okay? So capital goods, that's what investment means. Now, Keynes writes, the only solution is for long-term investment to be controlled by the state. So the only solution is for government to control the capital goods. That's what he's saying. In the general theory, he writes, a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment will prove the only means. So he's saying this is the only policy that will work of securing an approximation of full employment. So let's look into the history of this. In 1910, Keynes writes, investment will often depend upon fashion, upon advertisement, or upon purely irrational waves of optimism or depression. So you could find this passage in the general theory. This shows that by 1910, he had already developed this very pessimistic view of private investment. In 1924, he writes, the state encouragement of new capital undertakings is becoming an inevitable policy. The very next day, he writes Prolegomena to a New Socialism. And I know it's hard to see, but he writes that investment of fixed capital is one of the chief preoccupations of the state. So by 1924, he's already advocating government-controlled production. And it's hard to see, but up there, actually, he lists population and eugenics as the other chief preoccupations of the state. So a lot of people don't realize that he was a passionate supporter of eugenics. In 1925, again, he spoke to the Soviet Politburo, and he writes, I direct all my mind and attention to the development of new methods and new ideas for effecting the transition from the economic anarchy of the individualistic capitalism which rules today in Western Europe towards a regime which will deliberately aim at controlling and directing economic forces. So again, that word control is important. He says, I believe that there are many other matters left hitherto to individuals or to chance, which must become in the future the subject of deliberate state policy and centralized state control. So centralized state control, and he says, let me mention two, the size and quality of the population, so that brings us back to eugenics, and then he says the magnitude and direction of employment of the new national savings per year. And of course, we employ savings in investment, so he's saying we need centralized state control over investment, and I should point out here, he says the magnitude and direction. So he's not only saying the volume, but also the direction in which that investment occurs. A lot of Keynesians will say, hey, you know, he only wanted to control the magnitude, not the direction. But no, he wanted to control the direction too. In 1926, Keynes spoke at the Socialist Summer School, and Beatrice Webb recorded in her diary, Keynes seems such a treasure, I see no other man that might discover how to control the wealth of nations in the public interest. So control the capital goods, right? So again, this is socialism. In 1926, the Labor program, that is the Socialist Party in Britain, their program was called Socialism in Our Time, and he actually inspired the Labor Party to include centrally planned investment in their program, right? So here the Socialist Party is admitting that centrally planned investment is a socialist policy, and Keynes inspired this policy, right? So it was well known in Britain at the time that Keynes advocated this policy, right? It wasn't a secret. In 1928, he proposes a Board of National Investment. He says the Board of National Investment will mobilize and maintain the supply of capital in the stream of savings. And so you can think of this Board of National Investment almost like an investment Politburo. 1929, again, his speech, Social Reform is the New Socialism. He says modern economic organization is liable to produce unintended and undesired results unless it is controlled from the center. And then he says, I conceive that the greatest contribution that the politically minded can now make to social progress is by thinking out the central control scientifically sound. In a treatise on money, he writes, perhaps the ultimate solution lies in the rate of capital development becoming more largely an affair of the state, determined by collective wisdom and long view. So again, you could put that in the general theory, right? In a survey of the present position of socialism, he writes, the central control of investment is urgently called for on practical grounds. In the 1932 draft of the general theory, I mentioned that the last chapter was called Socialism, but the last chapter was actually contained in book 4, and that book was called this Control of Production. So again, he's aligning socialism with control of production. I think that this is probably when it comes to policy, this is probably my favorite passage coming up here. He says, a large measure of control over the volume of investment, that's what he advocates. And again, he aligns it with this National Investment Board, but look what he says here. He says, I should expect that its chief problem would be to maintain the level of investment at a high enough rate to ensure the optimum level of employment. The grappling with these central controls is the rightly conceived socialism of the future. So here he's admitting that his policy of controlling investment is a socialist policy. It's the true socialism of the future. In his lectures, in his 1932 lectures, he says that there's no unemployment in a socialist state, but in a capitalistic society, you will have severe unemployment. He says private capitalism is in this matter an open scandal and grossly inefficient. There may be no remedy except the direction of long-term investment by the state. I mentioned that he voted for the Socialist Party in 1935. Their program, again, was called For Socialism and Peace. And this is, Hugh Dalton wrote this in his diary. I should just mention, Keynes's National Investment Board was in this policy for socialism and peace. And Hugh Dalton says, such a board will, I believe, be one of our most effective instruments of socialist planning and national development. So again, in 1935, we have the Socialist Party admitting that Keynes is advocating socialist policy. Here's another source to confirm that. So in the general theory, we find the weakness of the inducement to invest has been at all times the key to the economic problem. So again, he's focused on investment. That's the main focus for Keynes. He says, I conclude that the duty of ordering the current volume of investment cannot safely be left in private hands. I expect to see the state, which is in the position to calculate the marginal efficiency of capital on long views and on the basis of the general social advantage, taking an ever greater responsibility for directly organizing investment. And then he says, of course, a somewhat comprehensive socialization of investment will prove the only means of securing an approximation of full employment. So countercyclical policy will not work. Socializing investment is the only means, and he says socialization can be introduced gradually. After the general theory, he says that the Board of National Investment would, in one way or another, control by far the greater part of investment. He wrote to Roosevelt in 1938, durable investment must come increasingly under state direction. And he says that Roosevelt must treat investors like domestic animals. And by 1943, he wanted the bulk of investment under public or semi-public control. And 88 days before his death, he wrote that the idea of a national investment board is a very ancient one with me. I'm gonna have to skip ahead here because of time. What I'd like to say is Keynes, Murray Rothbard referred to Keynes, Joseph Salerno has also referred to him as a fascist. Again, I mentioned that a lot of Keynesians will sometimes align him with liberal socialism. I think the best way to describe his socialism is with this term non-Marxist socialism. He was a non-Marxist socialist. He was an elitist, and he rejected Marx's revolutionary tactics. He was more sympathetic to Soviet communism than a lot of his defenders want to admit, but he was a non-Marxist because he was an elitist and because he advocated gradualism. Okay, so that's it. Thanks a lot.
We have some time now for questions. Tom?
Keynes will be more popular than ever in Europe once this article is published. One question, though, is some years ago somebody sent me a page from the German language edition of the General Theory and said, Keynes says here that my system will work best in a totalitarian society. Do you know about that? Because I never got to sponsor anybody to translate it for me, but I don't speak German.
Yes, that is true. But you know, I think that's pretty well known, so I didn't include it in the speech. But yeah, Keynes was much more of a totalitarian than his defenders want to admit. One of the great problems with Keynes scholarship is that we allow, I shouldn't say we, but a lot of economists allow the Keynesians to do the historical research. And what more of us need to do is get into Keynes's papers and look through these with the Misesian lens. Because these guys, they can't do history because they don't know any economic theory, right? So that is a well-known passage, and I do agree that Keynes did have a lot of totalitarian elements in his writings, especially what he writes about population control. He was definitely an imperialist, and yeah, I'm writing other papers on those issues, but and also I should say he was fairly racist. That wasn't a term that was used in his day and age, but he was definitely hard on other races. So.
Bill?
Yeah, make that point. I mean, the Webbs, if have you ever read what the Webbs wrote about people of other races? I mean, it was, racism was part of that whole, you know, socialist movement at the time. And not that American progressives were just as bad.
Yeah, I think Bernard Shaw is very scary. If anyone ever reads Bernard Shaw, he was just a lunatic. I mean, the Webbs, Hayek and Mises both acknowledged the Webbs' imperialism, and so that there was definitely a very imperialistic element to this type of Fabian or Keynesian socialism.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, eugenics is part of the Progressive Party's platform. There's no secret about it.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Eugenics was part of the Progressive platform in the United States.
Mises says in Socialism, he says that socialism is inconceivable without population control, right? If you're going to control the means of production, well, the workers are the means of production also, right? The human production factors. So he says that you must control the population, the size of the population if you want socialism. Definitely.
Yes.
Can you say a few words about this Cambridge Society of Apostles? How many socialists and communists were there? Because it was a pretty much elitist organization that detected British intellectuals.
So Keynes, he became an apostle in 1903. By the 1930s, he was the father of the Cambridge Apostles, and I think about 80% of the apostles were Marxists, and the rest were what you might call like Fabian socialists. But they were almost all socialists at that time. Yeah.
Other questions for? We want to spread the wealth here. If there's other questions for the other speakers, Paul.
This is for Rafael. I was wondering, and I think this is like on your slide 21 or something like that. You were talking about the present value of all certified reserves of natural resources of each SOE would be included. How do you calculate out the present value? Because there aren't any markets or functional markets in Venezuela right now, so how do you envision just the mechanics of that?
Well, we think that the socialization board do some expertise people. For example, the oil wells, how much can worth the oil wells, and all. I think that through estimation, expertise, because the important is that this moment some enterprises maybe the assets are less than the liabilities, but it's because you have not the natural resources included in the accountability. If you include that natural resources in your own property, you will balance the accountability. That's it.
No. No, I don't see how you get. I mean, that's just guessing, right? I mean, these aren't markets to determine prices at all. I mean, right?
Sure, but
so why? So I don't see how that system can work at all.
How much is the value of the oil in the subsoil?
Okay.
That's
maybe you can do that for a couple of natural resources where there are world market prices. But if there's an office building on such and such street corner, I can't make a comparison with one in another city.
And of course, for that is just for the SOE that includes some natural resources.
Okay.
I think I saw. Yes.
If I understood, Rafael, if I understood it correctly, you said that leadership. You suggested that leadership be held only to a limited term of 3 years for each time. Did I understand that correctly?
No, the restriction would be just for sale the chairs. The Venezuelans. The Venezuelans couldn't sell the chairs for 3 years, but just the chairs that they obtain through those that's 70% that would be distributed in all Venezuelans. But the other chairs could be sold when people want.
Okay, and the rationale behind that, I'm sorry. limited term of 3 years?
Why?
Yes, why?
Why? Because at this moment, we think that maybe at this moment is not the best moment to give the chair completely full honor to the Venezuelans, because Venezuelans are looking for other things than the chair. Okay? They will exchange immediately that chair for anything. We're protecting for. We are not protecting more than the Venezuelan. We are trying to avoid that in some years people blame the free market of the program.
Yes, in the back. Yeah, that's you. Go ahead.
So just for a bit of clarification, I think you referenced that you want to avoid what happened in Eastern Europe, where a bunch of powerful people gathered up all the resources and now they have everything. That's what you're trying to do with this delay.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And another point of clarification, like with those office building things, the way you're going to determine that price is through auctions. Some of those things that can be auctioned, you'll just auction those off, and that's how the price will be determined.
Yeah.
Yes,
I have two questions. I would like to repeat my question for Rafael. Is it okay?
that's fine.
And a second one for Yuri. Rafael, remember you said that the number of state enterprises increased from 74 to
526.
Yeah, what is percentage of, I would say, private enterprise right now in Venezuela?
No, really, we don't have the number.
No.
It's very difficult because the private enterprises is decreasing. All years are closing all the private enterprises, but at this moment it's very difficult because that is numbers from 2016, 2017. At this moment, maybe you have more than 600 of state-owned enterprises, and you are not including in that the state-owned assets. For example, the buildings or the farms that were expropriated with it. Just as enterprises like PDVSA. Okay.
And the second one for Yuri. Remember there was a Soviet economist, a Russian/Soviet economist, Boris Brutskas, who lived approximately at the same time with Mises. Did he hear about Mises Boris Brutskas? Because essentially he came up with similar ideas, right? In 1923 or 1926. Did he have any knowledge of Mises, or he acted independently?
Yes, and he's. I remember that's a project which unfortunately I didn't pursue because Murray Rothbard he had an encyclopedic mind. He knew more than myself about history of economic thought in Russia. And I asked him once what do you think about publishing it. He sent me a letter, 18 pages about history, and he was talking about Brutskas. He was talking about Lange people, the people who thought that they can overcome the calculation issue, the problem of economic calculation. And then we had amazingly enough, I don't know if you remember Nikolai Fedorenko. He was the chairman of the economics department of Academy of Science and president of the Central Mathematical Institute. And he believed that they can do that with computers. That can be the knowledge problem would be eliminated by computer. But he, fortunately for himself, he came up with the idea that he can make a working 5-year plan if he will use 30 million years of computer time. that would be working. Yeah, so that's definitely. But there was also the Bogdanov was very close to Austrian School, and he was leading Austrians, and so there's the Austrian tradition in Ukraine as well. So that's how the kind of in Eastern Europe they had roots about that. Well, I mean, right now we live the Ukrainian city, that's Lemberg, the Austrian, where Mises came from, and they have the Mises society now in all of these countries. There's a wonderful book by Soto, which is right now being copyrights and it's published, and you can all access this book on the Poland website. They have Mises institutes everywhere, in Russia, in Estonia, in Lithuania, in Latvia, everywhere, in Scandinavia. So that's the school which I think is the most popular today from the non-socialist schools, because it was the school which was fighting socialism so consistently and logically for such a long time. And I remember that was in this, when I was, my major was history of economic thought and economic history, which then they renamed into critique of bourgeois, vulgar political economy. And that we had Hayek and Mises, they were considered to be devil's incarnate. Yeah, and half of all our textbook on this vulgar bourgeois political was about Austrian School.
So you got to read it.
We have time for maybe one or two more. Paul?
This is for Ed Fuller. You mentioned that you got your hands on Neville Keynes's diary. Is that published somewhere? No? Okay. Then because I've always been fascinated what Neville Keynes thought of John Maynard Keynes's general economic theory, because he outlived his son.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure about that. I've never really looked into what Neville thought. Neville helped, he was Alfred Marshall's main collaborator on principles of economics. Yeah. And so I think he was definitely more of, I wouldn't say a classical economist, but more like Alfred Marshall. Right. Yeah. If you want, I can look into that.
Please,
come talk to me, I'll look into it.
Yeah. Even Richard Ebling doesn't know.
Okay. Give me your email address, I'll look into it.
Oh, nice.
That's impossible to believe.
Yes.
That doesn't exist.
Yeah, this is for Edward as well. So I think your archival evidence is fascinating. That's really cool. But I think we recognize why the question is important. Why do you think, assuming a modern day Keynesian would accept your argument? What do you think their rebuttal would be?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this, but to fully understand Keynes's theory, you have to understand his politics, because he developed his political ideas much earlier, and his political thought motivated his economics. So if you're a Keynesian and you really, really want to understand Keynes and you really want to realize his vision, they have to be honest about Keynes's vision, or it will never be realized. So they're kind of in this dilemma that if they hide his political thought, they're never going to achieve Keynes's goals, right? But if they admit that he was a socialist, then maybe he's not as influential. So they're kind of in this dilemma, right? So I think that if I were a Keynesian, I would certainly want to embrace this, right? It's something that I think they're going to have to come to terms with over the next couple of years.
Tom?
On this topic, Brad DeLong, who's a Keynesian protege of Paul Krugman, he recently blogged how happy he was that the left is now being dominated by Bernie Sanders and this Acacia woman from Westchester County, New York. And so there's a Keynesian who's saying, bring it on, bring on the real socialists. And he praised them for, this is the future of our movement. And so I was only half joking when I said Keynes will be more popular than ever in Europe once his article is published. Because I think the younger generation, like the Brad DeLongs, might have the attitude that finally we can be out in the open. We don't have to hide anymore who we are.
All right, well, I think our speakers will stick around for a few more minutes if you have other questions. I think we're about out of time, but thank you very much for attending today.